So hi again, everyone. Thank you for joining this SAT trial class session. My name is Jane and I teach SATs at Makers. So before we begin, I would like to explain how regular classes at Makers typically work. Normally, students complete a mock test before a class, and our class time is spent reviewing and discussing the questions that you have already solved. So in other words, we focus on your mistakes and thought processes rather than reading the passage together for the first time. But because this is a sample class, we will be reading and solving the questions together in class because you guys wouldn't have had the chance to look at the questions beforehand. So today's session won't necessarily reflect how we review your actual mistakes, which is how we do it at Makers, but it would rather serve as an introduction to my teaching and explanation style. And for today's class, I selected questions from the real SAT exam. So these are past paper questions. If you enroll in a class at Makers, you will work with both the official SAT past paper question and mock test developed by our team. We currently have all the past papers from August 2025 all the way through May 2026, which is the May one, and today was the June test, so we don't have that yet. And students will be able to work through these actual past paper over our summer program. Because SAT does frequently reuse questions from its question banks, practicing with these materials can be highly beneficial. Exposure to previously used questions, it will allow you to be more familiar with the test pattern and question style. And if you take the actual test and if you encounter questions that are similar or repeated, which you definitely will, you will be saving a lot of time, and time is a big issue in SAT, so it will be beneficial for you. The Makers Made test, for the Makers Made mock test, our mock tests are designed to follow the exact logic, trap, and problem-solving skills required on the real SATs. However, we intentionally make them slightly more challenging. The passages are often longer. The problems, the vocabulary is a bit more advanced, and the reasoning required to arrive at the correct answer, it can be a little more demanding. And the reason why we do this, the goal is simple. If you train with questions that are harder than the real SATs, the actual test will feel much more manageable. And in fact, many of my students from last summer, 2025 summer, many of my advanced and clinic level students, they scored above 700 in reading and writing section on the August SATs. And you guys, I'm not sure you guys have heard, but August SAT last year was really hard. And while not all of them did achieve their target scores by August test, because many of my students wanted a score that's above 750, many did complete their SAT journey by the December SATs. So what this tells us is that consistent practice with challenging material, that it does play a significant role in achieving the score that you want. And that said, for today's sample class, I wanted to focus on real SAT questions so that you can develop a clear understanding of the actual difficulty level and the type of thinking required on test day. So these are not Makers Made questions. These are questions from the actual past papers. So first question that we're going to look together is a literature question, and it's also function of the underlying question. And as you guys can see, this is from Shakespeare. So I'm going to read the question and all the answer choices out loud. You guys may follow with your eyes. The following text is from William Shakespeare's circa 1611 play, The Winter's Tale. Camillo has been away from his home in Sicily and serves in the court of Polixenes, the king of Bohemia. He has asked Polixenes for permission to return to Sicily. Polixenes says, I pray thee, good Camillo, be no more importunate. 'Tis a sickness denying thee anything, a death to grant this. To this Camillo responds, it is 15 years since I saw my country. So I have for the most part been aired abroad. I desire to lay my bones there. Besides, the penitent king, my master, has sent for me, to whose feeling sorrows I might be some ally, or I overween, or presume, to think so, which is another spur to my departure. And we are supposed to identify the function of the underlined portion in the text as a whole. A, it conveys Camillo's recognition that one benefit his presence may afford the king of Sicily is merely speculative. B, it suggests that Camillo feels compelled to persuade Polixenes that Camillo's decision to leave the court is justified. C, It establishes Camilla's hope that Polixeni will be comforted, knowing that Camillo isn't departing at his own discretion. D, it bolsters the idea that Camillo's primary motivation to return home is his concern for the King of Sicily's well-being in his absence. So this is the question. And I'm sure you guys know, but reading this part really is important in solving SAT literature questions. What we're told here, we're introduced to the fact that Camillo serves in the court of Polixenes and that Polixenes is a king of Bohemia. So this establishes the hierarchy in their relationship. But having that hierarchy, knowing that hierarchy, it doesn't tell us how they feel about each other. Their relationship could take many different forms. They might have a very loyal, trusting king-servant relationship, or they could actually really dislike each other. However, we do know that as soon as Polixenes starts speaking, it becomes pretty clear that they share a strong and close bond. So here I brought the modern English version to this. I pray thee, good Camillo, be no more importunate means. I beg you, good Camillo, do not insist any more. 'Tis a sickness denying thee anything, a death to grant this. It pains me to refuse you anything, but granting this request would feel like death to me. So this is pretty, like, it really tells us that Polixeni would very much like to say yes to anything Camillo asks, except to allow him to leave because they have such a good relationship. So if a king and a servant have such a good relationship, why would Camillo want to leave? That is, we can find that in Camillo's response. He says, it has been 15 years since I last saw my country. And although he has really been spending a lot of his time away from his home country, I desire to lay my bones there. He wants to be buried there. So what this part tells us is that Camillo must be pretty old. A very young gentleman wouldn't have a desire to lay their bones there. So Camillo must be a very, very old servant. And he goes on, besides, the sorrowful king, my master, has sent for me. I might be able to ease some of his suffering, or maybe I'm assuming too much in thinking so, but that is another reason pushing me to leave. So Camillo is explaining that number one, he wants to leave because he wants to die in his home country. Number two, the king of Sicily has asked for Camillo, and he believes that his presence might be some sort of a comfort to the king, so he wants to go back. That's another reason that why he wants to go back to Sicily, despite having such a good relationship with Polixenes. So returning to the answer choices, we can tell immediately that the right answer is A. He hopes that he might offer some comfort or relief to the king's deep grief. And the function of the underlined portion, right after he says that he might comfort the king, Camillo immediately qualifies his statement by adding, or I presume to think so. And by using the word presume, Camillo is acknowledging that he might be overestimating his own importance or impact. So in other words, the idea that his presence will actually help comfort the king is speculative. It is like a pretty accurate speculation because the king has indeed asked for him, but it isn't 100% guaranteed that his presence will definitely comfort or relieve the king. That's what he assumes, and that's what he hopes will be true. So he is recognizing that one benefit to him returning to Sicily is actually speculative, is what A is saying. And that's why A is the right answer to this question. When we look at B, it suggests that Camillo feels compelled to persuade Polixeni that his decision to leave the court is justified. This is incorrect because while the passage as a whole is part of an argument to leave, the specific underlined portion functions as a moment of self-doubt and kind of a modesty regarding his impact on the King of Sicily. It's not a direct tool to justify his departure, so B would be incorrect. C, it establishes Camillo's hope that Polixeni will be comforted knowing that Camillo isn't departing at his own discretion. So there is no indication that Polixenes will find comfort knowing that Camillo was sent for. In fact, Polixeni just simply states that letting Camillo leave in general feels like death, and this C would be way too speculative, so it is incorrect. D, D is also incorrect because Camilo already stated that his primary motivation is to lay his bones there. So I desire to lay my bones there is presented as the primary motivation. And how do we know that? Because he claims that that offering the King of Sicily some sort of a comfort is another spur, the additional reason. So this can't be the primary motivation if he specifically stated that this is like another spur to his departure. So this is what makes D incorrect. So SAT literature questions, they can be pretty challenging. I know that many of my students don't particularly enjoy literature or poetry, especially Shakespeare's. So yeah, but the good news is that to do well on SAT literature question, you guys don't have to like literature. You guys just need to be familiar enough with it to approach these questions confidently. So familiarity is more important. And if you guys meet this question in the real test, on the test day, you will typically have only about 3 to 5 minutes to solve it. So if you guys have trouble understanding Shakespeare or poetry or reading literature, you guys will have to practice hard over summer. The good news is that you do not need to be a literature expert to answer SAT questions successfully. Basically, AP English literature level analysis is definitely not required. And at Makers, we teach students how to work with the parts of the passage that you guys do understand, connect the bits, connect the dots, and develop just enough understanding to navigate the answer choices effectively. Today, I did all of the explaining, but if we were to meet in a class and if we were to interact more, you guys will have more practice in connecting the dots and finding the meanings. So, next question. This is a question that I would call a hypothetical inference question, in which where you would have to directly support or weaken something that is mentioned in the passage. So let's just read this question out loud. In a series of experiments, Julius Davila and Claudia Townsend showed that manipulating the space between products and store displays can influence consumers' view of those products. Participants in several of the experiments regarded the same product in the same generic retail setting as significantly more valuable when the product-to-space ratio was low than when it was high. But in one of the experiments, Davila and Townsend arranged the same jewelry with different levels of intervening space at an upscale retailer, Tiffany & Co., and a relatively inexpensive retailer, Forever 21. The result of this experiment suggests that a store context associated with inexpensive products may moderate the effects Davila and Townsend observed in their other experiments. So A says, at both Tiffany & Co. and Forever 21, participants judged jewelry spaced far apart to be less valuable than jewelry spaced close together, but the difference in perceived value was significantly greater at Tiffany & Co. than at Forever 21. B, when jewelry was spaced far apart, participants judged the jewelry at Tiffany & Co. to be more valuable than the jewelry at Forever 21, but when jewelry was spaced close together, participants judged the jewelry at Tiffany & Co. to be less valuable than ones at Forever 21. C, at Tiffany & Co., participants judged jewelry spaced far apart to be substantially more valuable than jewelry spaced close together, but at Forever 21, participants judged jewelry spaced far apart to be only slightly more valuable than jewelry spaced close together. And finally, D, participants judged jewelry spaced far apart at Tiffany & Co. to be similar in value to jewelry spaced far apart at Forever 21, but participants judged jewelry spaced close together at Tiffany & Co. to be more valuable than jewelry spaced close together at Forever 21. So this could be very confusing. And what I want you guys to notice is that the answer choices are pretty long. SAT is getting really, really longer in their passage and the answer choices. So when we are solving support and weaken type of questions, we need to focus on two things. Number one, what exactly are we trying to support or weaken? And in this passage, we're trying to support. And what background information do we need to keep in mind in order to understand that claim accurately? So for this question, we have to deconstruct two core results. Number one is the general rule of the space to value effect. It is saying that a low product to space ratio, meaning that items are far away from each other, it makes them look more valuable versus when they are really close to each other. So when they're far away from each other, they look more valuable, whereas when they're placed near each other, they look less valuable. So that's rule number one that we have to remember. Rule number two that we have to keep in mind is the moderating context rule. So when it was tested at an upscale store, the expensive stores like Tiffany & Co. versus an inexpensive store like Forever 21, the inexpensive context, it moderates the effect. So the spacing, making the items looking more valuable, that is moderated or weakened. And a lot of the times my students don't know what moderated means statistically. And understanding how research is conducted and the basic framework behind statistical and academic research, they can be really helpful for the SATs. So a lot of the SAT science questions, they're based on research. So knowing that framework is going to help you. So if you took AP Psychology or AP Statistics, you guys probably will have no trouble with this concept, but students who have not, they could be confused about what a moderating variable is. And at Makers, we do cover this concept so that students can develop a stronger foundation. This allows the students to approach research-based questions with an internal framework so that you guys will be faster in analyzing and organizing the information that is presented in the passage. So for this question specifically, if the products are spaced far apart, they appear more valuable. This was the rule number one. However, depending on whether or not the store is an expensive store or an inexpensive store, that acts as a moderating variable, meaning that it changes the strength of the effect. So if the store is upscale and the products are spaced far apart, it will seem more valuable. However, if the store is inexpensive, the same spacing may not have as much of an effect. So in other words, the perception of increased value is moderated or weakened by the fact that the store is not an upscale store. This is exactly why the store's context is considered the moderating variable. It influences the relationship between product spacing and perceived value. This could be really confusing, but you guys will be repeatedly going over these types of concepts in class. So try to do your best in understanding as much as you guys can. And that is why, knowing that framework, we can choose C because it supports the first reason. At both stores, jewelry spaced far apart was still judged as more valuable than the one spaced close together. The basic rule still holds true. And then the second result is also supported. The inexpensive context of Forever 21, it moderated or weakened the effect. So at Tiffany & Co., the extra space made a substantial difference in perceived value. But at Forever 21, that same extra space, it only made a slight difference in the perceived value. So because the store has a reputation for being cheap, not too expensive, it dampened the luxury cue normally provided by the wide spacing, and hence C becomes correct. So if you guys knew that, this question wouldn't be too hard, but a lot of my students get confused with all the variables mentioned. A is incorrect because it claims that jewelry spaced far apart was seen as less valuable. This completely contradicts the first result established in the prompt, so it wouldn't support anything. B and D are both incorrect because they focus on comparing the Forever 21 and Tiffany & Co. directly at specific spacing levels. We're not trying to compare these two stores. We want to look at the moderating effect. So if you guys didn't know this framework, B and D would be really confusing to you guys. But B and D ultimately failed to show that the inexpensive store, they actively weaken the spacing to value dynamic. So C is the right answer. And then this is a logical completion question. So let me read this out loud as well. Exclusively inhabiting tropical countries such as Ghana, wild chimpanzees lack adaptation to seasonal variation in ultraviolet B irradiance from sunlight, since UVB exposure enables vertebrates to synthesize vitamin D. Sophie Moide and colleagues studied zoo chimpanzees in Spain and other mid-latitude countries to see how vitamin D levels are affected by the seasonal variation in UVB irradiance that occur in these locations. They found that chimpanzees' vitamin D levels were significantly lower in autumn than in summer and appeared unaffected by oral supplementation of vitamin D administered by zookeepers. Moide and colleagues point out, however, that supplementation was rare, highly varied, and poorly tracked, and therefore, and A, the effect of supplemental vitamin D on Jew chimpanzees in Spain and other mid-latitude countries can more clearly be observed in summer than in autumn. B, the possibility that zoo chimpanzees in Spain and other mid-latitude countries would benefit from supplemental vitamin D during autumn cannot be excluded. C, vitamin D levels in Jew chimpanzees in Spain and other mid-latitude countries may be higher during autumn than Moide and colleagues' data appear to indicate. D, differences in vitamin D supplementation likely explain more of the difference in vitamin D level across zoo chimpanzees in Spain and other mid-latitude countries than seasonal differences in UVB irradiation do. So when we are solving logical completion question, we need to pay attention to what information is actually necessary to complete the author's logic. So a common mistake students make is getting distracted by all of the variables, details, background information mentioned in the passage. Not every detail is equally important. For example, in this passage, the yellow highlighted part, they're not as important as the blue highlighted part. Just because they're not as important doesn't mean you don't have to understand them or you don't have to read them. You do have to read them for background information, but you have to focus more on number one, oral supplementation did occur. Number two, it was not frequent, it was not consistent, and it was not well tracked. These are the key information that we need to keep in mind. Everything else is supporting background information. The correct answer should logically follow from these two facts. And oftentimes the trap answers would fit with all of the explanation in the yellow part, and they would make perfect sense with the yellow highlighted part, but they're not specifically addressing these 2 points that we want to keep in mind to logically complete this sentence. And that's why students oftentimes get logical completion questions wrong. So here, the right answer is B, because the problem was that the chimpanzees, they don't have adaptation for seasonal drops in UVB light, which happens in mid-latitude countries during autumn and winter. Their vitamin D levels significantly dropped in autumn. That was the problem that was introduced to us. And the observation is that at first glance, oral vitamin D supplementation, they seemed like it appeared to have no effect on preventing this drop in autumn. And the pivot, however, that we have to really focus on is that there is a major flaw in how the supplements were handled. They were rare, highly varied, and poorly tracked. If you guys are taking your vitamins every day, you want to take them every day. If you take it like once or twice a month, it won't be effective. And this is what the passage is saying. Because the supplementation was so inconsistent and poorly managed, the researchers couldn't actually run a clean test. You can't declare that a treatment doesn't work if it wasn't given properly or if it wasn't tracked accurately. Therefore, the door is still open. We can't say that if we give it to them regularly, it would 100% help them. We can't say that. But it is entirely possible that a well-regulated, consistent supplement program would benefit the chimpanzees during autumn months. So we don't want to keep that door closed. So cannot be excluded is a very scientifically balanced approach to explaining that we should still leave that door open. And A is incorrect because if the supplements were poorly tracked and rare all year round, you wouldn't be able to see their effect more clearly in summer than in autumn. So it doesn't make sense. C is also incorrect because the sloppy tracking of supplements doesn't mean that the actual vitamin D measurement taken from the chimpanzee's blood, the data, were wrong or underreported. their levels were low, and there is no reason for us to kind of doubt the data that's presented in the text in SATs. So C would be incorrect. D is incorrect because it contradicts the main finding. The text says that seasonal change in UVB radiation is the primary driver of the vitamin D drop. The supplements were too rare and erratic to explain the broad differences in vitamin D levels, so D would be incorrect. So we went over 3 questions today, and before we wrap up, I would like to emphasize one final point about today's lesson. Because this was a sample class and trial class, I spent much more time reading the passage, explaining the passage themselves, discussing what they meant, and walking through the thought process behind each question. Which means, in other words, today's lesson was designed to be accessible to a broad range of students, particularly targeted towards those who would be in intermediate or pre-advanced range. And in a regular makers class, you will be placed into levels that best match your current scores and abilities, and the instruction and lecture styles will be adjusted accordingly. So for intermediate level students, we focus on building reading comprehension, identifying key information, understanding passage logic, and developing reliable approaches to different questions, which is similar to what I've done in class today. And at advanced level, the focus really does shift. We spend less time simply trying to understand what the passage says, because a lot of my advanced level students have very good comprehension skills, so we don't need to do that in class. We try to spend much more time analyzing how College Board constructs questions. We examine traps hidden in the answer choices. We dissect the logic behind the passages. We identify recurring patterns that test makers use to mislead and trap students. And for advanced level students, the goal is not to just understand the passage, but to understand how SAT testing itself works. So if you decide to join makers, today's lesson will be viewed more as a general introduction to how I explain things rather than a complete representation of what everyday class looks like. Once you're placed into the appropriate level, instructions become much more targeted to your specific needs and score goals. So thank you for joining today's sample class, and I hope it gave you a better understanding of both the SAT and the way we at Makers approach SAT preparation. If you guys have any questions, I would like to respond. If you guys don't have any questions, it's fine. I'm going to stop recording.